जय जय देवी गिरिजा माता,
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 जय जगदम्बे प्रणव स्वरूपिणी,
जय जगदम्बे प्रणव स्वरूपिणी,
जय जगदम्बे प्रणव स्वरूपिणी,
जय जगदम्बे प्रणव स्वरूपिणी,
अष्टभुजाङ्किता अखिलाधारिणी, अष्टभुजाङ्किता अखिलाधारिणी,
अष्टभुजाङ्किता अखिलाधारिणी,
जय योगीश्वर हृदय निवासिनी,
जय योगीश्वर हृदय निवासिनी,
जय योगीश्वर हृदय निवासिनी,
जय योगीश्वर हृदय निवासिनी,
जय जय देवी गिरिजा माता,
जय जय देवी गिरिजा माता,
जय जगदम्बे प्रणव स्वरूपिणी,
जय जगदम्बे प्रणव स्वरूपिणी,
अष्टभुजाङ्किता अखिलाधारिणी,
अष्टभुजाङ्किता अखिलाधारिणी,
जय योगीश्वर हृदय निवासिनी,
जय योगीश्वर हृदय निवासिनी,
जय योगीश्वर हृदय निवासिनी,
जय योगीश्वर हृदय निवासिनी, जय जय देवी गिरिजा माता,
जय मां जय मां दया करो साई मां,
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 मुक्ति प्रदायिनी प्रेम प्रदायिनी शांति प्रदायिनी मां,
मुक्ति प्रदायिनी प्रेम प्रदायिनी शांति प्रदायिनी मां,
मुक्ति प्रदायिनी प्रेम प्रदायिनी शांति प्रदायिनी मां,
प्रदायिनी प्रेम प्रदायिनी शांति प्रदायिनी मां,
जननी जगजननी साई माँ जननी साई माँ
जननी माँ जननी जग जननी साई माँ
दया करो साई माँ जय माँ करो साई माँ
करो साई माँ
जय माँ जय माँ दया करो साई माँ
जय माँ
जननी साई माँ
जननी माँ जननी जग जननी साई माँ
दया करो साई माँ जय माँ कृपा करो साई माँ जय माँ जय माँ दया करो साई माँ
सुंदर वदनी सुगुण मनोहरी
सुंदर वदनी सुगुण मनोहरी
सुंदर वदनी सुगुण मनोहरी
सुंदर वदनी सुगुण मनोहरी
मंदहास मुख शशिवदनी मंदहासमुख शशिवदनी
मंदहासमुख शशिवदनी
सुंदर वदनी सुगुण मनोहरी
सुंदर वदनी सुगुण मनोहरी
चंदन कुंकुम अलंकृत वदनी
चंदन कुंकुम
राजराजेश्वरी
साई महेश्वरी राजराजेश्वरी
ॐ शक्ति ॐ शक्ति ॐ शक्ति ॐ शक्ति ॐ
शक्ति ओम शक्ति ओम शक्ति ओम शक्ति
ॐ शक्ति ॐ शक्ति ॐ शक्ति ॐ शक्ति ॐ ॐ
धारणो भूयासं शरीरं मे विचर्षणं जिह्वा मे मधुमत्तमा कर्णाभ्यां भूरिविश्रुवं ब्रह्मणः कोशोऽसि मेघया पीतः श्रुतं मे गोपाय ॐ शान्ति शान्ति शान्तिः ॐ मेघा देवी जुषमाना न आगात् विश्वाची भद्रा सुमनस्यमाना त्वया जुष्टा दुदमाना दुरुक्तात् बृहत्पदेम विगते सुवीराः त्वया जुष्टऋषिर्भवति देवी त्वया ब्रह्मा गतश्री ऋतत्वया त्वया जुष्टश्चित्रं विन्दते वसुसानो जुषस्वद्रविणो न मेधे मेघा मनीन्द्रो ददातु मेघां देवी सरस्वती मेघां मे अश्विना भुवावा दत्तां पुष्करस्रजा अप्सरासुषया मेघा गन्धर्वेषु च यन्मनः दैवी मेघा सरस्वती सामां मेघा सुरभिर्जुषतादु स्वाहा आमां मेघा सुरभिर्विश्वरूपा हिरण्यवर्णा जगती जगम्या ऊर्जस्वती पयसा पिन्वमाना सामां मेघा सुप्रतीका जुषन्तां मयि मेधां मयि प्रजां मयि अग्निस्तेजो ददातु मयि मेधां मयि प्रजां मयि इन्द्रियं ददातु मयि मेधां मयि प्रजां मयि सूर्यो गायो ददातु ॐ हंसाय विद्महे परमहंसाय धीमहि तन्नो हंसः प्रचोदयात् ॐ शान्ति शान्ति शान्तिः
Om Sri Sai Ram. My loving and humble pranams at Bhagavan's lotus feet. Respected elders, dear brothers and sisters, Sai Ram.
Om Sri Sai Ram, our most humble and loving pranams at Bhagavan's lotus feet. As my brother said, respected elders and my dear brothers and sisters, Sai Ram to all of you.
Today we would like to speak a little bit of our experiences with our grandfather, Brahmasri Gandikota Subramanya Shastri Garu, and father, Sri Gandikota Subbarao Garu, and their experiences with the divine Swami, who is the Veda Purusha. Our grandfather was born in 1896 into a Vedic family. He spent his early years steeped in Vedic learning. He went to a Veda Pathshala, learned from his father and his gurus the Vedic learning, and at an early age, in his early 20s, he was a Ghanapati. He was a Vedic Pandit, but he was also a Vedartha Pandit, one who could explain the meaning of the Vedas as well. It was in the late 1950s that our grandfather first saw Swami in Rajamundry area, East Godavari district. It was around 1958 or 1959. Prior to that, our grandfather, after he was he finished his Vedic learning and he was a Pandit in the Godavari area of Andhra Pradesh. He was asked by the Maharaja of Vijayanagaram to be the Asthana Pandit. He was invited to become the Asthana Pandit of the court of Vijayanagaram. Our grandfather accepted and he spent many years there. The Asthana Pandit or the court Pandit would not just be one who would speak spiritual items, but also would be an advisor to the king and to the queen. So he spent those years there. as a pundit, court pundit. And after he retired and came back and settled down in Tanuku, West Godavari district, and also in Rajahmundry for some time, that's when, in late 1950s, he first had darshan of our beloved Swami. And at that time, from the first day that he saw Swami, he recognized that divinity that is Bhagavan Sri Sathya Sai Baba.
It was this experience which our father and our grandfather, but I remember clearly, vividly how our father described it to us brothers. You know, our grandfather, of course, was steeped in Vedic learning and was a pandit, as my brother explained. And generally, at least, you know, from my side, when we think about it, you know, one could think that when we look at Swami, it could be very hard for a Vedic Pandit to recognize Swami as divinity, because Swami could be so unorthodox in certain ways. Swami is both traditional and he's modern. Swami represents everything to everybody. And so when you look at Swami's I guess when you look at Swami with the orange robe, Swami's hair, you know, just recognizing Swami as divinity, I mean, not only for Vedic Pandits, but for all of us, it's something that, you know, we wouldn't normally think about. But there is something so captivating about Swami's form, and that it is the uniqueness, and that is the way it was described by our father. When our grandfather laid eyes on Swami for the first time, bang, their both eyes met, and it was a situation where our grandfather immediately recognized, and Swami, of course, puts that divine connection to that it made him recognize that Bhagavan is Sarvadevata Swarupa, the embodiment of all forms of divinity, that Swami is the Yuga avatar, the avatar on this earth at that time. So it was it was a moment that was so poignant with meaning, and something that our father and grandfather would always relate to us.
And with that first meeting of Swami, of our grandfather meeting Swami, it was a journey to Swami and with Swami after that. Our grandfather and family would go to Puttaparthi, spend a lot of days there in the early 60s. And that's when Bhagwan had begun the Prashanti Vidwan Mahasabha. It was a gathering or a conference of Vedic scholars that Swami had initiated. And our grandfather was selected and given the blessings by Swami to be one of the founding members of this Prashanti Vidwan Mahasabha. And as my brother Sanjay mentioned, you know, for a Vedic scholar to not only follow, you know, a divine personality on earth, it's not an easy thing. A lot of Vedic Pandits in those days, not all had the ability to recognize the divine, and it's no fault of theirs. The Vedic scholars live by the book. They follow the Vedas. And so our grandfather, and along with a number of other Pandits who had that sense of Bhagwan being divine as the Veda Purusha, joined in this Prashanti Vidwan Mahasabha in Prashanti Nilayam. And Swami would sit with them on the stage, talk about Vedic subjects. And even when later on, when we were watching our Swami, watching Swami and our grandfather converse, it was a beautiful sight. And I think, Sanjay, you would remember when we were little, we were sitting in the interview room with Swami and our grandfather. Our grandfather would always tell us, in Swami's presence, never initiate any conversation. Let him initiate, because you do not want to limit the divine. And so our grandfather would never open his mouth in front of Swami unless asked to by Swami. So this was the relationship our grandfather had to Bhagavan or with Bhagavan, that of a devotee, that of one who learned at the feet of the divine. So basically, it was like a gurukul for our grandfather.
And as my brother Ravi said, we were just happy to be there to witness, all of these interactions, these divine interactions.
And so along with this Prashanti Vidwan Mahasabha, Swami also would initiate the Dasara Yajnas for the welfare of society. As we know, the Dasara Yajnas are done to foster the Vedas, but also to foster the devotees. And that's what Swami himself has said he had come for. Fostering of the Vedas and fostering of the devotees. And the Dasara Yajnas that Swami would perform in Prashantilayam were beautiful to see. Sanjay and I, we had the opportunity to sit, as when we were students there, to sit up front and take photos and videos of these beautiful moments of Swami mingling with the Vedic scholars on stage as they set up the sacred Homagundam, which is that sacred steps made out of bricks where the fire is kept, and that is where the yajna would be performed. And so we'd like to explain one beautiful incident that our father had narrated.
So this incident happened in the 1960s, the way our father described it. In Prashantilayam, the Vedic Pandits were doing a Somayaga, a Vedic Somayaga sacrifice that Swami had asked them to do. And in the context of that sacrifice, two of the Pandits actually had a slight disagreement on the arrangement of the sanctified bricks in terms of the construction of the altar. This is a very, very specific area of knowledge that very few people in India, or let alone the world, really know. It is the preserve of just a handful of people in various parts of India who know the ritualistic part of actually performing a yajna. And this is again not something that even Vedic, if I can may be so bold as to use the word regular Vedic Pandits, even though all of them are so well educated, that it is not the preserve of them, it is the preserve of a very small strata and very arcane, very ancient knowledge. And so when we look at Swami, so they were having this disagreement, and they had it on how to arrange, and then they both went to Swami and said, Swami, what is the correct way to arrange these sanctified bricks? When we look at Swami, Swami never formally went to a Vedic Gurukulam to learn. And this was a wonderful example here of how Swami is the Veda Purusha, the source and the essence of all Vedas. Swami actually looked at both of them and said, it is not the solution that you propose, and it is not the solution that you propose. The solution is actually this third way of arranging the bricks. And, the two Pandits were surprised. They went back, consulted their Shrauta texts, and then realized that for this time, for this place, for this circumstance, that the solution that Swami proposed was the ideal one. And they were flabbergasted, and they fell at Swami's feet. So it was another example of how Swami is the Veda Purusha. No formalized Vedic teaching, but the Swami is the Veda Purusha.
Yeah. When we talk of Swami as the Veda Purusha, we recall how our father, who also went to a Veda Pathshala, who also studied some of the Vedas through under our grandfather, his father. Later he switched his education to English and came to the US and worked in the United Nations for 35 years. But every couple of years, whenever we went to India, my father would always spend time with his father speaking of the Vedas, speaking of spirituality. So on one of these trips to India, we were with our grandfather in our grandfather's hometown in Thanuku at that time. This was in the early 1970s. And our father and grandfather had a habit of sitting on the veranda in the mornings, and they would chat about not worldly subjects, but our father always wanted to have as much time from a spiritual angle with our grandfather as much as possible, so that he could also learn from this great Vedic scholar. So he used to ask questions of his father. And that morning, our father asked grandfather, he said, Nana meaning father in Telugu. He said, Nana, you always say that whatever Bhagavan, whatever Swami says is from the Vedas. Can you prove it? Now, this question you may think may sound arrogant, but it was not asked out of arrogance. It was asked out of inquisitive curiosity, and also to elicit a response from this Vedic scientist, this Vedic Pandit, to show the proof, as it were. And so our grandfather looked at our father and said, Abbai meaning son, bring that Sanatan Sarthi that's there. And just that morning, a Telugu Sanatan Sarthi was dropped on the table by the postman. And this was always a momentous occasion to receive a Sanatan Sarthi in its brown wrapper with the Telugu writing on it. And so our father quickly got it, and our grandfather said, open up to any article that Swami has written and select a passage and tell me and show me that, and I will tell you where it came from the Vedas. And so our father opened up the Sanatan Sarthi. Swami would always write a beautiful article in every Sanatan Sarthi. And so he opened up to one of those articles, selected a paragraph and showed it to our grandfather. And our grandfather then said, Abbai, go and bring this book from the shelf where my bed is. And father brought that book to him. Our grandfather then opened it up and showed our father that specific paragraph that was exactly what Swami had written in the Vedas. Now, in the Sanatan Sarthi article. And through this method, he had proven to our father, not that any proof is needed, but just so that our father could understand that every utterance of Bhagavan, of Swami, was straight from the Vedas. Now, you needed to have that knowledge to understand where in the books you could find that, where in the Vedas you could find. And our grandfather had that knowledge. And Bhagavan, as a Veda Purusha, whatever he taught, whatever he said, was literally from the Vedas.
And Bhagavan having encyclopedic Vedic knowledge, Bhagavan is the Veda Purusha.
I'm taken back again to, this was 1977, and Sanjay and I were young. I was a teenager. Sanjay was about 10 years old, and I was around 17 years old. And this was Christmas Eve in Vrindavan, where the old bungalow was. And those of you who may have either been there or seen the pictures, the old bungalow of Swami in Vrindavan is beautiful. It was set amongst trees, the verdant, lush surroundings of Vrindavan, where Swami would give darshan. The Sai Ram shed was there. And the bungalow was a big house. And the front hall had Swami's chair in the middle, and it was a long hall where where the students could sit and guests would be sitting. And it was a beautiful late afternoon, around 4 or 5:30 in the evening, in the afternoon, that Swami had called the students into the hall there of the old bungalow. And we were visiting from the US, and so we were there. Our grandfather was there. Father had brought our grandparents to Vrindavan. And in fact, on that trip, Swami had actually asked our grandparents to stay with Swami in the bungalow. Swami arranged a room for our grandparents. Swami arranged a cook and somebody to look after them, and told our father, you and your family, you go stay in a hotel in Bangalore. You can come and go. I will keep your parents with me. And that was a beautiful blessing. So Swami had kept our grandparents in the bungalow there. And so this evening, Christmas Eve, 1977, December 24th, we were sitting there in the veranda of this hall with Swami sitting at the center. And Swami looked around at everybody, and we were all, as children, as young people, and that too we were guests, so we were all sitting in the back. Students were very close up front, students and staff. So then Swami looked at our grandfather and said, Subramanya Shastri, Pillal Kedina Cheppu, say something to the children, tell them something. He asked him to give a speech. Our grandfather, I distinctly remember, just held up his hands and smiled like this. You know, as I said earlier, he would never speak unless asked to speak in front of Bhagavan. So Swami again, a couple of times mentioned, so Shastri Garu, Chippu. And so then he started speaking on some Vedic topics. And because he speaks in Telugu and Sanskrit, Swami had asked our father to translate. Our father, coming from Veda Pathshala education, also knew Sanskrit, and he could translate into English. And so our father was standing and translating grandfather's speech. And right in the middle of this speech, our grandfather, as he was speaking, suddenly stopped. And his eyes, and Sanjay and I remember, his eyes went wide. His face had that look of wonderment. And then he turned and looked at Swami like this. And then Swami himself looked at him and said, Chippu Subramanya Shastri, Chippu. And that Chippu was like, reveal it. And that's when he revealed the Sai Gayatri. Om Sai Shvaraya Vidmahe Satya Devaya Dhimahi Tanna Sarva Prachodayat. He revealed it, and he explained it, and our father translated it. And then it was a momentous occasion. Then our grandfather turned and looked to Swami, and then he explained to Swami, or he asked Swami, he beseeched Swami and said, Swami, you are the presiding deity for this mantra. Every mantra has a certain scientific formula. It has to have certain syllables, it has to have a deity it is addressed to, and it has to have, a rishi that has revealed it. And so our grandfather looked at Swami in all humility and said, Swami, you are the presiding deity for this mantra. And then he asked, Swami, and then that's when Swami said, so you are the rishi for the Subramanya Shastri, you are the rishi for this mantra. And that is when Swami declared that and revealed it to the world. And later I remember in the room when we were sitting and talking to grandfather, he was saying that as he was speaking, this mantra just appeared in his mind. Now, our grandfather was trying to write a verse. Now, our grandfather was a Vedartha Pandit, and he was also a poet. And so he was trying to write a verse. And my uncle was telling me this. He was trying to write a verse in praise of Swami, but never could get it right. And that was difficult. And if he couldn't get it right, it's a difficult thing to do, to create these. You don't create mantras. These mantras are gifts of the divine. And so he abandoned that effort. And so when he was speaking, this mantra, the Sai Gayatri mantra, entered into his mind. It was a beautiful evening. And that's when, that was the origin of the Satya Sai Gayatri.
And I think it was, as my brother Ravi is mentioning, it was, I was very young, of course, my Ravi was a teenager, but when this event occurred, just the majesty in the room was palpable.
Yeah, it was very electric.
Yeah, it was very electrifying and electric, and something that we never forget. And, as my brother mentioned, it was a situation where both the receptacle of the grace, and maybe Ravi, you can speak a little bit about our grandfather, that it requires the receptacle, who is my has to be qualified. It's not just the revelation, but it is also having the qualifications in order to receive, and then the faith that goes along with it. So maybe if you
Yeah, I think that's a great point, Sanjay, that you mentioned, because, ultimately for a mantra, yes, you need the rishi. But the rishi, who is a rishi? He is somebody who has spent his life in the inquiry of the divine. So in this case, our grandfather, and again, not just because he is our grandfather, because he was a Vedic Pandit. He spent his life in Vedic learning. So he had that technical skill or technical knowledge, as it were. So one must have that in whatever we do in daily life. If we want to be an instrument of the divine, it's important that we have two things. This is something I feel, or we feel, that one is the technical knowledge. We need to have the skills. We need to have the knowledge to be able to perform whatever task. But in this case, this is a divine task, or is a divine revelation. And so you also need to have faith. Now here was a Vedic Pandit. Like I said earlier, Vedic Pandits believed only what was in the book, never looked at individuals, whether they had divine qualities or not. What was written in the book was what they believed. But our grandfather and a lot of other Pandits who came to Swami felt was that, no, this is the divine incarnation on earth. This is divinity himself on earth. And so they transcended that Vedic, that link only to the Vedic texts, to the ultimate divinity that is Swami. And so they had that faith. So one was the technical skill, the next was faith. And when that technical knowledge of Vedic learning was there, that allowed other Pandits who may not have known of Swami to know, okay, this is a Vedic scholar who spoke about this. And then our grandfather had that faith. So ultimately, with that faith and surrender to Bhagavan, that Vedic sacred mantra was put into this receptacle of our grandfather's mind. And so, as Sanjay mentioned, the receptacle, we have to be worthy instruments. And in this case, Swami chose Gandikota Subramanya Shastri as that receptacle, as that instrument.
Yeah, the importance being the faith, the bhakti, and the surrender. And as my brother Ravi mentioned, as our father explained to us, this is not a calculation of just how the mantra fits together from a grammatical standpoint. The potency of each verse is very important, and that potency can only be bestowed when you have the Paramatma, you have the Veda Purusha like Swami potentizing it along with the Rishi here in our grandfather. So it was a really wondrous occasion.
Yeah. And I take that as a lesson for myself, that if I want to be a worthy instrument, whether it is in seva, if I have to do seva, I need to have the skill and that faith to be able to do it. So whatever we do in life, whether it's in seva, whether it's in our daily work, whether it's in bhajans, whether it's in teaching balavikas, we have to have that skill and faith, and then ultimately Bhagavan will provide us that lift or that support.
Now, there was another instance which we also wanted to convey, again, about our beloved Bhagavan being the Veda Purusha, the source and the essence of all Veda, the source as well as the goal of for all of us, and of the Vedas particularly. This incident happened to take place in Vrindavan. Our father, Gandikota Subbarao Garu, he described it to us, and I remember this vividly. On one occasion, our father had Swami was very kind. He would give our father opportunities to speak in front of the students in Trai Vrindavan. Of course, Ravi, as a lecturer there in Vrindavan, is aware of all those wondrous experiences, and myself as a student, we both together were in many of these sessions, and these were just heavenly, if I could use that word. I mean, they were just, just wonderful in all ways. On one such occasion, Swami was asking all the students were assembled there, and the guests were in the back and the elders and all of that, and there were a number of students there. And Swami was looking at all of the students very playfully, and he said, today I want to ask you a question. Who is the form, or what is the form of divinity that is worshipped first? And Swami put this question, as our father narrated it to us, Swami put this question to all the students. And so he asked all the students to answer. Someone said, Lord Ganesha. And Swami said, you're only partially right. Someone said, Brahma. And Swami said, oh, you're partially right. And then all the while, Swami was actually looking at our father, and then he looked at our father and would say, Subarao Chapuka. Subarao, don't say the answer. Let them, let them say their answers, and then, so Swami very playfully was doing this. And then someone said Vishnu, and Swami said, oh, you're partially right. Someone said Shiva, and he said, you're partially right. So then Swami looked at our father and said, Subarao Chipu. And our father actually, this is the way he described it to us, our father looked at Swami, put his hands together like this, and chanted the first line of the Rigveda, where I think the line goes, Agni Vile Purohitam Yajnasya Deva Ritvijam. So Swami, when he heard that, was very, very happy, because our father mentioned that the primordial deity, the first deity that is prayed to, was Agni, or is Agni. And that is something, again, that Swami wanted to convey. And see, this is where Swami is the Veda Purusha, right? Yeah. These are the first few lines of the Rigveda. And just to digress a little bit, we all love to hear these separate factoids, but incidentally, when the and please check me on this, I believe this is the case, but when the phonograph, this was turn of the century times, when the phonograph was invented, the Alexander Graham, I know Thomas Edison, I think, invented it, and then Alexander Graham Bell kind of improved on it. And when he made that improved phonograph, I believe it was Alexander Graham Bell actually called a Max Muller, who is somebody who has a Westerner who came in and studied Vedic, the Vedas and the Vedic tradition, asked him to say a few words into the phonograph, which was going to be the first recording, or one of the first few recordings. And he actually chanted this first line of the Rigveda, Agnimile Purohitam. And apparently they were all wondering what was, what does that mean? What is that? And Max Muller said, because this is a new invention, I wanted to chant the first line of the most ancient spiritual text in this in this phonograph, for it to be the first set of sounds that come out of that. So it was, I'm sorry to digress, but that was just an interesting factoid. But going back to Swami was extremely, extremely happy when our father mentioned that and said, yes, it was Agni. Agni was the first. And during that time, he asked our father to speak about Agni, and our father spoke about that entire episode. And of course, at the end of that, Swami actually was so happy he materialized a pendant for our father. And that pendant has a Om on one side and a representation of Shiva on the other. And during the course of our father's talk, our father had talked about how in the Rigveda, Agni is also adored, has characteristics of Rudra and Shiva. And when we talk about Agni and Shiva, sometimes there's a bit of being synonymous because of the Shivalanga being represented as the pillar of fire, and fire being Agni, and all of those others. So I think in various of the Vedic texts, the Rigveda, Shatapatha Brahmana, and other places, there's this synonymousness between Rudra and Agni, and so that's why Swami materialized this locket, this pendant, and our father described it to us that while Swami was materializing it, in a reference to Agni and what they discussed earlier, there were literally sparks coming out of the bottom of Swami's palm. I'm sure, Ravi, you remember that, how our father narrated it. Yeah. And so that was a wonderful, and Swami he called our father and said, Subara, come here. And he said, do you have your sacred thread? Are you wearing it, your Yajnopavit? And of course our father said, yes, Swami. And he said, okay, pull it out. And Swami took it and very deftly put it within his sacred thread and then put it inside and said, yeah, you keep it with you always. So again, this was a incident that our father narrated, just which represented Swami as being the Veda Purusha, the source, the essence, and the goal.
Yeah, that's a beautiful incident that really, brought home to everybody there. And I remember some of my colleagues from Vrindavan talking about this incident. We'd like to leave you with one last incident, and this happened. This was on the first day of Dasara, actually, in when our grandfather had left his body in Swami and merged into Swami. And so our grandfather, he was unwell for a few days, and he was staying in Puttavarthi. Swami had asked him to come, and our father and mother brought him and kept him in Prashantanilayam, and Swami had graciously given a room there inside the ashram. And so our grandfather, by that time he was already bedridden, he was old, and he was having trouble breathing. He was taken to the hospital, and he was put on oxygen. And this was the general hospital in those days, and so in 1987. And so our grandfather was in the hospital. Our father would spend his time with him, and this was before Dasara started, and this was also during that column where it's not a good period. And like Bhishma, who was kept alive until the good muhurtam to pass and leave the body, Swami had kept our grandfather alive. And on the first day when the Punya Kalam started, early morning, our father, who would be spending all his time in the hospital, he would come only back to the house just to sleep for a couple of hours, take a bath and do Sandhyandanam early morning, and then he would go back and spend time with grandfather, and then come for darshan, and then go back to the hospital. That was his routine. That particular morning, our father had come home, and he had taken a shower, and he was sitting in his silk dhoti and doing his Sandhyandanam. And in the course of the Sandhyandanam, and this is what he explained to us afterwards, during the Sandhyandanam, he suddenly had this prompting. And this is only Swami. Swami, when we listen to the inner voice, that we're listening to Bhagavan. And he had the prompting to go and see his father immediately. And so our grandfather, without even telling mother, just opened the doors of the flat, walked out in his Sandhyandanam clothes, in his dhoti, silk dhoti, and just an angostram on top.
Our father,
and he was walking straight to the hospital.
Very uncharacteristic at this early morning hour.
Early morning hours, he wouldn't go. And early morning hours, the only people around would be sweepers, or there would be people who would be delivering milk or newspapers, and they all knew our father, and they were all saying Sai Ram. And that morning, he would just say Sai Ram and walk away. And later, these people would tell us, normally he would always stop and talk to us, but that morning he has one pointed going all the way.
There was an urgency.
So he went to the hospital, and he reached the hospital and went to our grandfather's bedside, kept our grandfather's head in his lap, and then he looked at our grandfather. Grandfather then asked him to remove the oxygen mask. And then he said, Abbai, I've been waiting for you to come. This was early morning, Brahma Muhurtam time, and he told him, Abbai, come close. So he brought him, asked him to put his ear close to his mouth. Then he told him, Bhagavan Satsai Baba Varu is Sarva Devata Swarupa. Never let him go. He held his hand tight and said, never let him go. He said, and this was our grandfather's last words to our father. It was not about anything else except never leave the lotus feet of the Lord. Something that you have gained, never leave. And naturally, not our father never would have left, but this was that prompting that our grandfather gave him. And after that, our grandfather was explaining that after that, our grandfather would just chant some mantras, and then he left the body and merged into the divine, into Swami. And so that's a lesson for us, from a Vedic scholar to his son, a Vedic Pandit who had recognized the divinity on earth. And that was a lesson to his son to never leave the divine. And that is a lesson for all of us. We have the great good fortune of knowing this grand avatar, Bhagavan Sri Sat Sai Baba, and we have to never let that pearl of that devotion drop. Always stay connected. And that was that parting message that our grandfather gave our father.
Yeah, it was something that our father would constantly keep repeating to us. And in fact, our father would very affectionately call it the Gandikota Rahasyam. But in all seriousness, it was one of those things where, again, a very powerful moment. And look at Swami's divine grace and compassion. With our grandfather having immersed his entire life in Vedic lore, in the Vedas, and immersing it in thinking about Swami. See how Swami took care of him at the end. He allowed him, he called his son to come from the, literally, for, again, as a calling, early morning, very uncharacteristic, and made sure that our father was there, and that our grandfather was able to chant the Lord's, Swami's name, the Lord's name, in those last few moments, and also convey this very, very, very powerful and important message. That is how Swami takes care of, it's a great lesson for us to see that when we leave, when we surrender to Swami, Swami will always take care of us from beginning, middle to the end, always. And that is, Swami has constantly given us his assurance that he is always with us, in us, and around us. And he is constantly guiding and protecting us. And this was a great example of that, where, our father would call this rescuing a Vedic scholar from the jaws of death. Because literally this wasn't just him passing away. This was a very, very unique way of him, merging with Swami. And Swami later said, he has merged in me. So this is a very wondrous example of that.
Yeah. We're ever grateful to all of you and to Bhagavan for this opportunity to be with you today. And we are ever grateful to Swami for all the love that he has given all of us. Jai Sai Ram.
Jai Sai Ram. We're very grateful to Swami and to all of you. Jai Sai Ram.
पाद्यं समर्घ्यं समर्घ्यं वस्त्रैकं समर्पयामि उपवेदं समर्पयामि गन्धान्धराय पुष्पैः पूजयामि अग्नये नमः हुतवहाय नमः हुतात्मने नमः कृष्णात्मने नमः देवमुखाय नमः सप्तैक्वाय नमः वैश्वानराय नमः धूमाग्रहं देवं आज्य नैवेद्यं समर्पयामि भूतभवत्सुतरवरेण्यं भर्गप्रचोदयात् तेन पञ्चामि देवताभ्यो नमः आज्य नैवेद्यं समर्पयामि अमृतमस्तमस्तमसिवं प्राणायस्ताः ओम प्राणायस्ताः ओम व्यानायस्ताः ओम उदानायस्ताः ओम समानायस्ताः मध्ये मध्ये पानीं समर्पयामि अमृताब्धमस्तमस्तौ रक्षणामि पदरक्षणामि परशुद्धाय ताम्बूला सर्वोपचार पूजां समर्पयामि द्वासगृहीतेनाट्येन सृजं पूरयित्वा అలా కాదు ఆ పెద్ద సృక్కు అది ఏకం ద్వే త్రీణి చత్వారి పంచ షట్ సప్త దశ ఏకాదశ ద్వాదశ. అది నువ్వు పట్టుకుని ఆయన పౌరోపరిషజనం చేయమను నారాయణ. అది నువ్వు పట్టుకో. ఓం అదితేను మన్యస్వ
అనుమతేను మన్యస్వ సరస్వతేను మన్యస్వ దేవ సవితః ప్రసూవా. समिधः सप्त जिह्वा सप्त ऋषयः सप्तधाम प्रियाणि सप्तहोत्रा सप्तधात्वा यजन्ति यो नेरापुनस्वा घृतेन स्वाहा. अग्नये सप्तवतैदन्नमः आहुतिमुत्तमाञ्जुहोति सर्वं वै पूर्णाहुतिः सर्वं. सजितवा एषा हूयते कुरस्यवा एनमेषा धारामुष्मिल्लोके नोपतिताज्येन जुहोति तेजो वा आज्यन्ते जो वसोर्धारा तेजसैवास्मै वरुन्धे तो कामा वै वसोर्धारा कामानेवा वरुन्धे. सजोषसे मा वर्धन्तु वाङ्गिरः जुम्नैर्वाजेभिरागतम् वाजच्च मे प्रथवच्च मे प्रेदच्च मे प्रतिदिच्च मे धेदुच्च मे क्रदुच्च मे च मे श्लोकच्च मे श्रावच्च मे श्रुतिच्च मे ज्योतिच्च मे सुवच्च मे प्राणच्च मे पानच्च मे च मे चित्तञ्च मे वाक्च मे मनच्च मे चक्षुच्च मे तनोच्च मे सर्वं वै पूर्णाहुति सर्वमेवाप्नोति अतो इयं वै पूर्णाहुति अस्यामेव प्रतिष्ठति. आत्मतो प्राणायामश्च विष्णुर्विष्णुर्विष्णुः एतावत्पर्यन्तं नाना सकलदोषविहरणार्थं सर्वप्रायश्चित्तं करिष्ये.
మానవత్వము దివ్యత్వాన్ని పొందే నిమిత్తమై అనుగ్రహించినటువంటి యొక్క కాయమే కానీ పెడమార్గముల లోపల ప్రవేశపెట్టి ఈ యొక్క కాయమును దుర్వినియోగపరచుకోవటం కాదు.
The body is given to man to experience the divine, attain the state of divinity and not to misuse it.
ఈ దేహమును ఎంత పవిత్రముగా వినియోగించాలో మీరు యోచన చేయండి.
Understand clearly how sacred this body should be used and considered.
తెల్లవారు లేచింది మొదలుకొని రాత్రి పరుండునంత వరకు కూడాను మన లౌకిక ప్రవర్తనలో కాలమునంతా గడుపుకుంటూ కట్టగడపటికి నిద్రించే సమయంలోనైనా కూడాను దైవాన్ని స్మరించడానికి వీలు లేకుండా చేసుకుంటున్నారు.
Right from dawn to dusk, the moment we get up from bed until we retire, we spend the whole day eking out a living in worldly thoughts and worldly pursuits, and we don't have time to think of God.
మలమూత్ర దుర్గంధ మాంస రక్తములు కానీ పురుగు జవ్వాజీలు పుట్టబోవు.
The body emits foul smell. It is not anyway aromatic or fragrant.
నిమిషమునకు నీచులూరిని కానీ పరమశాస్త్రములంతా పుట్టించలేవు.
You cannot expect any kind of sense out of this body.
ఈ దేహము ఈ విధమైనటువంటి దుర్గంధముల చేత అనుభవిస్తూ ఉన్నప్పుడు దీనికి ఎంత సుగంధములను పూజాలి.
The body, that's naturally as days pass by, emits bad smell, and we apply scents to make it fragrant.
ఈ సుగంధములే భగవంతుని యొక్క చింతనలు.
Actually speaking, the perfume is the divine thought that we entertain.
దినమునకు ఒక పర్యాయము 2 పర్యాయములైన కూడాను భగవంతుని యొక్క చింతన చేసి ఆ హృదయాన్ని పరిశుద్ధపరచుకోవాలి.
We should purify our heart by thinking of God once or twice every day.
తల్లి తండ్రులు ఇద్దరు వచ్చి, నాయన నీ భక్తి ప్రపత్తుల చేతని నీవు తిరిగి ఈ ప్రపంచంలో నిలిచగలిగావు.
The parents said so that, son, you could live long, you could earn the
భగవంతునికి ఏది
blessings
కూడా ఇవ్వనక్కర్లేదు.
because of the devotion towards God.
పరిశుద్ధమైనటువంటి దేహము,
A clean body,
పవిత్రమైనటువంటి మాటలు,
sacred words,
నిర్మలమైనటువంటి దృష్టి,
and pure looks,
నిస్వార్థమైనటువంటి నడక,
and selflessness.
ఇవి మంచిగా ఉండినప్పుడు భగవంతుడు తప్పక మనకు వశమైపోతాడు.
When these are there, God will certainly bless you.
సుబ్రహ్మణ్యం షణ్ముఖనాథ సుబ్రహ్మణ్యం 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 షణ్ముఖనాథ సుబ్రహ్మణ్యం 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 షణ్ముఖనాథ సుబ్రహ్మణ్యం 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 షణ్ముఖనాథ సుబ్రహ్మణ్యం శివ 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 సుబ్రహ్మణ్యం హర 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 సుబ్రహ్మణ్యం ఓం శివ 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 సుబ్రహ్మణ్యం హర 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 సుబ్రహ్మణ్యం శివ శివ హర హర సుబ్రహ్మణ్యం హర హర శివ శివ సుబ్రహ్మణ్యం శివ శివ హర హర సుబ్రహ్మణ్యం హర హర శివ శివ సుబ్రహ్మణ్యం శివ శరవణ భవ సుబ్రహ్మణ్యం శివ శరవణ భవ సుబ్రహ్మణ్యం జయ శివ శరవణ భవ సుబ్రహ్మణ్యం శివ శరవణ భవ సుబ్రహ్మణ్యం ఓం శివ శరవణ భవ సుబ్రహ్మణ్యం శివ శరవణ భవ సుబ్రహ్మణ్యం శివ శివ హర హర సుబ్రహ్మణ్యం హర హర శివ 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 హర హర సుబ్రహ్మణ్యం హర హర శివ శివ సుబ్రహ్మణ్యం 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 జయ సుబ్రహ్మణ్యం 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 ఓం సుబ్రహ్మణ్యం 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 సుబ్రహ్మణ్యం
సమస్తలోకా సుఖినో భవంతు సమస్తలోకా సుఖినో భవంతు సమస్తలోకా సుఖినో భవంతు शांति 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 जय बोलो भगवान श्री सत्य साई बाबा जी की जय।